And welcome back to our continued discussion on bone tissue, and bone anatomy. Today we're going to be looking at more so the gross anatomy of a long bone in particular, classifying based on shape and some of the internal structures. When we look at shape of any bone for classification purposes, it's important to know what the names actually refer to. First off, when we look at a long bone, it's important to know that that's not meaning gross length. It's dimensionally described. A long bone is a bone that is much longer than it is wide. So picture here in this diagram, we have our femur categorized as a long bone. It is obviously much longer than it is wide. However, the bones that make up the palm of the hand, the metacarpals, those are also long bones. Significantly shorter than the femur, but that does not make them short bones. A long bone is dimensionally longer than it is wide, regardless of the stature of the bone. So the humerus, the femur, the metacarpals, the tibia, the fibula, the ulnar, those are all long bones, regardless of their stature. Short bones are more so cube-like. Think about the carpals that make up the wrist as being a good example of a short bone. Many of the tarsals that make up the foot, the cuboid, the cuneiform. Flat bones, again, are not meant to imply that they're flat. It's more so an indicator of a consistent thickness. So here on the diagram, we have the frontal bone. Now, I know in lab, not many of you will get to handle what we call disarticulated bones. The closest you'll get to that in lab is a skull with the top of the skull removed like a cap. Well, the frontal bone is a flat bone, the parietal bone is a flat bone. It doesn't mean that when you sit them down on a table, they lay flat like a book would lay. But if you measure the density, the thickness across that bone, it's going to be rather consistent, even though you'd be well aware that once you take the top off the skull and tip it upside down, it's bowl-shaped, for lack of a better description. But those are still what a flat bone gets categorized as. Sometimes flat bones will still have irregularities. Thinking about the scapula, as I say that, shoulder blade. For the most part, it's a very thin bone. However, it has projections, the acromial process, the spine of the scapula. But just those few irregularities don't take away from its flat bone classification. And then lastly, we get the irregular bone class. And essentially, we're talking about anything that didn't fit into the first few categories. The vertebra is a good example. No parts of this bone make it fit into any other category. We got several projections. We've got no elongated structure. We've got no consistent thickness throughout that bone. Great example of an irregular bone. In the skull, we get some very irregular bones. The maxilla, the sphenoid, the ethmoid bones, all extremely irregular bones. Now, we see some terms pop up in anatomy that I want to first and foremost make sure you realize that these are terms relating to the long bones only. Diaphysis, epiphysis, metaphysis, they only apply to long bones. These terms are not used for the short bones, the irregular bones, or the flat bones. The diaphysis is where we want to turn our attention to first. It's the shaft of the bone. Every long bone has got one piece that we refer to as the shaft. That's the diaphysis. Every long bone has got a singular shaft. On the proximal and distal ends, we are going to have our epiphysis. So each long bone would have two epiphyses, one at each proximal and distal end. The metaphysis now becomes the region of the bone in between each epiphysis and the diaphysis. So the red circle would be the metaphyseal region of the bones here on the diagram. Now the metaphysis, I left that for the last of the three to point out where it is, because it's the one that's least distinct. You know, if you follow the shaft proximally and distally, you're going to get to a place where it starts to flare and become irregular. There you know the shaft is done. The epiphysis will always refer to the areas of the bone that articulate with another bone. So they'll be covered with hyaline cartilage. But somewhere in between both of those is going to be this no man's land, so to speak. That's your metaphysis generally. Now, last class, we talked about the epiphyseal plate, the growth plate. Now, that name is extremely misleading because the epiphyseal plate is not found in the epiphysis of the long bones. We find the epiphyseal plate located in the metaphyseal regions. So we'd see the epiphyseal plate run along the metaphyseal regions of the long bones. Each long bone will have generally two articular surfaces, sometimes more. And the ones at the proximal and distal end will always be associated with the epiphyseal regions. Covered with articular surface hyaline cartilage, reduces friction, acts as a shock absorber. And inside the shaft of the bone, we'll have this hollowed out region called the medullary cavity. There was where we'll find some red and yellow bone marrow. Associated with the long bone, we also see two other membranes. We mentioned them last class. The periosteum on the outside of the bone, and we get an endosteum lining the medullary cavity. You'll see the periosteum referred to here as it's peeled off of the bone. Okay, first of all, it won't peel off of the bone as easily as it looks like that. This periosteum is formed by a cellular layer with bone cells. It has a fibrous layer of very dense tissue. And it has these perforating fibers that anchor it into the surface of the bone. And those prevent that membrane from being lifted off of the surface of the bone. The only times you'll really see the periosteum leave the surface of the bone is due to some degree of infection or process occurring just underneath the membrane, forcing it away from the bone. This periosteum is part of the structure of the bone. It gives the bone more structural integrity. It is structural in function. I don't know how many more ways I can describe that. But the endosteum, the membrane lining the cavity, is not structural. It's a physical feature in there, but it is not there for structural integrity. It doesn't make that bone stronger. The endosteum is metabolic. Remember where we found our bone cells. Out here at the surface, we see osteoprogenitor cells. We see osteoblasts. Activity outside of the periosteum is all about bone growth. And the fibrous layer of that periosteum reinforces how important the periosteum is to the bone strength. The endosteum, however, we find osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So we have the cells in place there to deposit minerals and withdraw minerals. So it's the endosteum that takes on more of a metabolic role, particularly as we described calcium being deposited and withdrawn into and out of the bone. On the surface of these bones, you are going to see any number of bone markings or bone features. These are going to be left for lab material. It is going to be routine for lab for you to be given a bone. You have a laundry list of features you need to learn on the surface of that bone. And in an exam, there'll be a sticker on one of the features, and you will have to look at that bone, say what the bone is. Is it a left or a right bone in some circumstances? And what feature the sticker happens to be on. We will not be asking you about bone features in lecture. Again, I mentioned this last class. We're going to leave lab with the gross bone identification. In lecture, we are going to look at more of the microscopic terms and the processes involved with bone rolls. These long bones, well, any bone really, but the long bones in particular have a special pattern of blood supply and innervation. Around the mid shaft of each long bone, you will see a large opening, and in some situations, if you get your hands on an actual specimen, not just like a plastic copy, but if you get your hands on an actual specimen, around mid shaft, it might look like someone took their pencil and just jabbed it into the bone. That is going to be the nutrient foramen, foramen meaning opening or hole, that the large nutrient artery will penetrate through. And it will make its way through the network of bone and into the medullary cavity. Some branches will come off of the nutrient artery to run underneath the periosteum, the periosteal arteries. But the majority of branches that supply that bone will come off of the nutrient artery from inside the medullary cavity and then start working its way back through the tissues from there, going through all those perforating canals and central canals. We also get a metaphyseal artery and an epiphyseal artery in each of the epiphyseal and metaphyseal regions, penetrating the bone at their particular sites. So make sure when you're studying this material, be very specific on what the question is asking. Because you can imagine if someone said, "What's this?" They could be referring to the epiphysis as a region, or they could be referring to the spongy bone as bone composition. Please read the questions carefully so you know exactly what's being asked of you. All terminology here. So if you're a memorization person, this is where you want to break out your cue cards. This is where you want to really get down and dirty with the memorization. And if you have any questions, please reach out and let me know.